The Critique of Metaphysics in Heidegger and Adorno. In this paper, I shall investigate how the anti-metaphysical stance in Adorno and Heidegger remains ambiguous. Their rejection of traditional metaphysics leaves intact certain metaphysical commitments in a modified, refined, and most importantly, anti-traditional format. In an early essay from 1931, Adorno simultaneously critiques and saves the aspirations of metaphysical thought. He writes, "Whoever chooses philosophy as a profession today," he wrote this in 1931, "whoever chooses philosophy as a profession today must first reject the illusion that earlier philosophical enterprises began with, that the power of thought is sufficient to grasp the totality of reality." End of quote. Adorno justifies this bitter and disheartening view with the claim that the order and shape of the present reality is so bereft of all reason that no rational or reasonable account can be attempted. Leaving aside for the moment the odd topicality of this thought almost 100 years later, and passing over the potentially self-defeating character of the claim, since Adorno passes rational judgment on the reality as a totality, which is supposedly impossible. Adorno's point is that the sheer irrationality of the really existing order defies philosophical reason, forcing philosophy to renounce its former grand ambitions. Whoever still entertains the former philosophical ambition to understand the whole of reality as rational is suspect of producing ideology, according to Adorno. While Adorno's target seems to be primarily Hegel's so-called panlogism, i.e. that the real is rational and the rational is real, he actually questions the naive assumption of the intelligibility of what there is. I think that's a very naive assumption that underwrites a whole lot of metaphysics. But he never pursues this in terms of ancient or Adorno, oddly, never pursues his own worries by tapping into ancient or modern skeptical philosophies. So he claims that philosophy or metaphysics, and Jeff talked about that, that metaphysics and philosophy are very often simply substitutes for each other. Adorno does not realize that there were skeptical positions before him and before German idealism. Now, nonetheless, for Adorno, philosophy survives as critique, and only as critique, finding its foothold in the marginal, the non-integrated, the non-identical. In this pared-down critical version, philosophy, so Adorno, can hang on to its task of what he calls interpretation, Deutung. But Adorno does not entirely eliminate the aspiration of philosophy. As he puts it, quote, "The point of interpretive philosophy, deutende Philosophie, is to construct keys before which reality springs open." End of quote. According to Adorno, the keys provided by German idealism tend to be too big to even fit into the keyhole, while sociological keys tend to be too small. Still, the philosophical search for a key to open up reality survives. Adorno's gesture must be read as a response to the actual marginalization of metaphysics or philosophy in society at his and our time. Acknowledging the fall of metaphysics, that's a phrase that Adorno used later, Adorno is bent on saving philosophical thought in the face of its threatened total liquidation, that's his term, at the hands of the positive sciences. According to Adorno, philosophy has to disburden itself from the content that belongs by right to the sciences and which merely cloud philosophical questioning. So keeping on the old stuff is clouding philosophical questioning. Philosophy can avoid pending irrelevance by giving to the sciences what belongs to them and focus on its own domain. But what is that? It certainly is no longer, as Kant would have it, the business of laying the foundations for the sciences, nor is it the orientation towards a synoptic view of all sciences or the theoretical grasp of the totality of all beings, since Adorno holds that the conceptual mastery over the totality of all beings is impossible. What then remains for philosophy? So this is a text that is not well known, but it is in his collected works. I assume that this text from 1931 is authentic. Adorno's answer is somewhat baffling. Philosophy, Adorno claims, must concentrate on interpreting the, quote, riddle figures of beings and their astonishing intertwining. I can give it to you in German, for those who speak German here. Die Rätselfiguren des Seienden und ihren wunderlichen Verschlingungen nachgehen. So, to interpret the riddle figures of beings and their astonishing intertwining or intertwinings, if we can say that in English. The riddle, das Rätsel, is not to be decoded by recourse to some suprasensible realm containing the key to what appears in the riddle, as if the riddle was a symbol waiting to be deciphered. Rather, the solution consists in the analytic arrangement of the riddle's elements in such a way that the answer suddenly springs forth, exploding the question and thereby illuminating or even transforming the initially given reality. Now comes a long quote so that you don't think that I all make this up. Authentic philosophic interpretation, this is all Adorno, does not meet up with a fixed meaning which already lies behind the question, but lights it up suddenly and momentarily and consumes it at the same time. Just as riddle solving is constituted, and that the singular and dispersed elements of the question are brought into various groupings, long enough for them to crystallize in a figure out of which the solution springs forth while the question disappears, so philosophy has to bring its elements, which it receives from the sciences, into changing constellations, or to say it with less astrological and scientifically more current expressions, into changing trial combinations until they fall into a figure which can be read as an answer, while at the same time the question disappears. End of quote. No wonder then that Adorno favors the essayistic form and happily forfeits all systematic aspirations. Indeed, Adorno suggests that philosophy is best at projecting models of reality. We are coming close to what Dennis said. Models of reality by making the imagination the organon of philosophy. In this regard, Adorno even approvingly references Bacon's Ars Inveniendi. In addition, Adorno claims that just as philosophical solutions to riddles explode them from the inside, so historical materialism, he writes in 1931, solves the riddles in material existence by practically revolutionizing reality and solving or sublating the riddle in that practical way. The this worldly credo of historical materialism also holds for philosophy, of course. Philosophy's task is the illumination of reality in the here and now, and not the determination of the thing in itself or some noumenal or supra-historical realm. Still, Adorno keeps the metaphysical impulse alive when he argues that philosophy has to find the right key with which reality is opened up, the key before which reality springs open and becomes transfigured, though not affirmed in its present state. As an example, Adorno refers to the category of the commodity form, originally discovered by Marx and then greatly extended in scope by Lukács. But for all his faith in historical materialism and his feigned nearness to historical materialism, I cannot help but feel that Adorno's elevation of the philosophical riddle is more akin to Novalis or Eichendorff than Marx. I'm thinking here of Eichendorff's wonderful poem, "A song sleeps in all things that dream on and on, and the world begins to sing, if only you find the magic word. End of quote. Adorno continues the tightrope act of keeping metaphysics at arm's length, while at the same time cultivating a genuine metaphysical impulse in his Negative Dialectics almost 30 years, more than 30 years later. Against the young Hegelian's premise that philosophy as such is outdated and must instead become practical by revolutionizing the existing order, Adorno now notes in 1966 that, quote, philosophy which once seemed obsolete lives on because the moment to realize it was missed. End of quote. Indeed, to give up philosophy after the moment of its realization in practice to give up philosophy after the moment of its realization in practice did not come to pass would be equivalent, according to Adorno, to defeatism of reason. Thus, Adorno affirms, quote, philosophy offers no place from which theory as such might be concretely convicted of the anachronisms it is suspected of now as before. Still, Adorno does not simply reinstate metaphysics, for after Auschwitz, metaphysics is no longer tenable, since it either neglects the temporal and intramundane as the merely indifferent side to transcendent ideas, or alternatively affirms the empirical course of history as the theater of rationality and reason. Mindful of the horrors of the 20th century, one can neither feign indifference to the temporal, nor can one imbue the senseless immanence with some meaning emanating from the affirmatively constructed transcendence. Hence, the capacity for metaphysics is, quote, paralyzed, for it cannot be balanced against the horrors of the real. Adorno's earlier unintelligibility thesis concerning reality as such takes on the form of an acute disorientation in 1966 when he writes Negative Dialectics. According to Adorno, the question today is not the epistemological one of Kant, i.e., how metaphysics may be possible, but how metaphysical experience is possible at all. For Adorno, metaphysical experience, and that is a phrase that he uses, it's in quotation marks, metaphysical experience is tied to a sense of fulfillment, elevation, and happiness. More specifically, the happiness of being at one with the world, being at home in it. Adorno refers to childhood experiences where one is entranced by just one particular town or place, without squinting at the universal, without making any comparison, being totally absorbed and enveloped by the charm of a home village, or rather a resort, in Adorno's case. Reflecting on his own childhood experiences and relating them to similar experiences recorded by Proust, Adorno writes, quote, to the child it is self-evident that what delights him in his favorite village is found only there alone and nowhere else. He is mistaken, but his mistake creates the model, here it is again, creates the model of an experience, of a concept, which finally would be that of the thing itself, not the poor abstraction lifted from things. By way of explication, Adorno argues that this experience opens up or unlocks the unique interiority of things themselves as something removed from their status as mere objects. These things can address the child in a way that is irreducible to rational calculation and exchange values. Yet, at-homeness is not a regression into pure immanence and immediacy. The child's favorite town is also the place of adventure and discovery. In fairness to Adorno, one must note that he refers to the childhood experiences as a model. And remember, that was what he said before. The finding a riddle solution, and so on and so forth, models of reality. This is a model, what he has experienced as a child. It's not the basis for systematic philosophy. Moreover, it's also clear that Adorno refers to the universality of this metaphysical experience, of these metaphysical experiences. They are not the special property of a people, a particular class or ethnicity. There is no praise of autochthony in all of this. Still, one wonders why this would be relevant to metaphysics. Is at-homeness a metaphysically relevant, fruitful, and illuminating concept? What has it got to do with being qua being, or the first causes of being, if we take that as a definition of metaphysics? Does it help to open up special fields in metaphysics? Jeff was talking about metaphysica specialis. For instance, is it opening up our cosmology, our theology, or psychology? Hardly. A more promising link instead can be established when we think of the famous aphorism by Novalis, according to which all philosophy is but homesickness. Or we may relate it to Hegel's idea that philosophy arises in response to the felt need to overcome the diremption and fragmentation of reality into separate sections without a coherent unity holding everything together. However, the contemporary context for Adorno is probably George Lukács. In his theory of the novel, in his theory of the novel, Lukács proposes a powerful image of being at home in ancient Greek times. This is how the book actually starts, the theory of the novel. Happy are those ages when the starry sky is the map for all possible paths, ages whose paths are illuminated by the light of the stars. Everything in such ages is new and yet familiar, full of adventure and yet their own. The world is wide and yet it is like a home. For the fire that burns in the soul is of the same essential nature as the stars. The world and the self, the light and the fire, are sharply distinct, yet they never become permanent strangers to one another. For fire is the soul of all light, and all fire clothes itself in light. Thus, each action of the soul becomes meaningful and rounded in this duality, complete in meaning, in sense, and complete for the senses. Rounded because the soul rests within itself even while it acts. Rounded because its action separates itself from it and, having become itself, finds a center of its own and draws a closed circumference around itself. Philosophy is really homesickness, says Novalis, is the urge to be at home everywhere. End of quote. Lukács' argument is that this unity, this being at homeness, is part of the epic form and the ancient Greek world. It is irretrievably lost in the modern world, which stands under a quite different star, transcendental homelessness, Lukács calls it. It is the destiny for us moderns, as, quote, we cannot breathe in a closed world, end of quote. But at homeness remains still a powerful utopian dream for Lukács. Indeed, Lukács' one-time friend Bloch puts the idea of at homeness as the ultimate telos in history. True Genesis, this is a quote from Bloch, true Genesis is not at the beginning, so not like Lukács would have it in the beginning of the Greek enterprise of philosophy. True Genesis is not at the beginning, but at the end, and it starts to begin only when society and existence become radical, i.e. grasp their roots. But the roots of history is the working, creating human being who reshapes and overhauls the given facts. Once he has grasped himself and established what is his without expropriation and alienation in real democracy, there arises in the world something which shines into the childhood of all and which no one has yet been, home, Heimat. There you go. Obviously, Bloch had read his Lukács as well. And he changes it, right? While this shows that the motif of at-homeness was taken up in German philosophy, we still need to find a philosophical account why it is that it becomes central for an anti-traditional concept of metaphysics. Turning now to Heidegger, his ambivalence about metaphysics leaves a relatively strong trace in his writings, but many questions remain nevertheless. One might be inclined to say that after his youthful attack on sclerotic theoretism and academic sterile philosophy, Heidegger settled for scientific philosophy in the sense of a fundamental ontology in being and time. But for all the verve with which Heidegger resuscitates or reinvents ontology or fundamental ontology and the question of being, it is quite conspicuous that Heidegger abstains from appropriating the name metaphysics for his project, although the question of being seems to be calling out for the traditional title metaphysics. Moreover, Heidegger's ontological distinction between beings and being, where being is not one of the entities of ta onta, but is the, quote, transcendence pure and simple, a phrase we can find in exactly this form also in Schelling, makes it distinctively metaphysical in the sense of the word, above or beyond the things we directly experience in our everyday concerns. Nonetheless, Heidegger would not want to characterize being and time as metaphysical, presumably because of the generally discredited status of metaphysics as such. However, in one aspect, being and time is indeed not metaphysical. Heidegger drops the standard ahistorical posture of metaphysics, since he foregrounds the temporal and contemporary as the starting point and endpoint of philosophy. There's no speculating oneself out of one's finitude and mortality and one's historical situation into a calm region of pure or eternal existence as such. There's no recourse to what might be indestructible. It is only in the 1928 lecture, What is Metaphysics? And then the Kant book and the lecture course Introduction to Metaphysics that Heidegger appropriates, and with some relish indeed, the name metaphysics for his thinking, precisely because it transcends. So he appropriates it in 1928, and he does it because his philosophy transcends everything that the positive sciences deal with, namely being and nothingness. Heidegger's hoisting the flag of metaphysics is a provocative move against traditional philosophy that has fallen asleep or contents itself with repackaging old and tried moves in metaphysics, or simply capitulates in front of the positive sciences. It is hardly an attempt to revive traditional metaphysics, which is not known for having ventured out into thematizing the nothing anyhow. In fact, I believe if we, so obviously not. In any case, already in the contributions to philosophy, Heidegger distances himself from all ambitions to a comprehensive system of philosophy. And the contributions were written in 1936. Almost like Nietzsche, Heidegger decrees that, quote, the time of systems is over. At the same time, and somewhat paradoxically, Heidegger starts his project of overcoming metaphysics. So there was a short window where he was appropriating metaphysics for his own purposes and for his own philosophy. And after that, he clearly is only interested in overcoming metaphysics. It is a paradoxical undertaking, I believe, because the history of being that provides the cover for the overcoming of metaphysics is a metaphysical system by another name. Obviously, not in my use of the sense of metaphysical. For Heidegger, then, metaphysics is now so for Heidegger, metaphysics is, and we are all familiar with that, is the world historical unfolding of a particular constellation of a consciousness and being, in which the human being as rational animal comes to order everything around him, to cognize, discover, and conquer it for its own purposes. The relentless objectification of everything vis-à-vis the dominant knowing subject, setting itself up as the presumed lord and master over everything, has ultimately led to the desolation of the world wars, and the anarchy of catastrophes, transforming the Earth from a wandering star or planetis, into, as Heidegger calls it, erring star, Irrstern. Heidegger's critique of metaphysics and its onto-historical underpinnings are surely informed by and reflect Nietzsche's and Schopenhauer's theorizing about the will to life or the will to power, and as such, the entire project is far more indebted to metaphysics than Heidegger would ever want to admit. Apart from that, I should perhaps add that Western philosophy is not as uniform as Heidegger's metaphysical or onto-historical account of being makes it out to be, and not all philosophy is metaphysics or rationalism. It's just a little bit too systematic for my taste. It is quite significant, I believe, that Heidegger never reflects on ancient or modern skepticism or stoicism, for that matter, empiricism, the English empiricists, with one or two rare exceptions, don't show up in his work. In any case, Heidegger's critique of metaphysics is animated by a normative, can I call it metaphysical ideal, the ideal of at-homeness, becoming at home on the earth, instead of simply exploiting it technologically or metaphysically. Heidegger writes in his essay, Overcoming of Metaphysics, quote, "It is one thing to utilize or use the earth. It is another thing to receive the blessing of the earth and to become at home in it, heimisch zu werden, in order to keep the mystery of being and the inviolability of the possible, Unverletzlichkeit des Möglichen." End of quote. In these lines, one may hear echoes of Nietzsche's call to be faithful to the earth, or Hölderlin's line, poetically man dwells on earth. It is important to see that what Heidegger calls home or Heimat is not a particular ontic affair of a designated piece of land or house that one might call home. It is an ontological, I'm inclined to say metaphysical condition first and foremost, namely the metaphysical condition of being at home in the world, almost like Lukács says the Greeks were at home in their world. Heimat, or the home, is defined by living in the nearness to being, as a neighbor of being, in the wonder that there is something rather than nothing. Indeed, Heidegger does not see the home as a closed horizon, but as the center for permitting the possible. This notion goes together with the idea of the free and freedom in his essay, Building Dwelling Thinking, for the sparende, and protective engagement of the environment one dwells in, wohnt in, is the ground for letting things shine in their essence, instead of handing them over to their cognitive or instrumental servitude in the standing reserve. In this sense, the home, the metaphysical home of Dasein, frees things and people from their servitude to the overall utilitarian spirit of metaphysics and technology. But this is possible only if the fourfold is manifest: earth, sky, divinities, and mortals. With regard to Dennis' paper, we might now say that the fourfold perhaps, looks to us as a new concept. However, the elements that he has under the fourfold, earth, sky, divinities, and mortals, are certainly older than the fourfold. And if you look it up in Plato, you find the direct reference for the fourfold, with one exception in Plato when he talks about earth, sky, divinities, and mortals. They are not held together by being, but they're actually held together by justice. And so where Plato has justice, Heidegger would have being, although very importantly in the fourfold, being doesn't show up within the fourfold. It is the fourfold. What Heidegger develops as at-homeness is this overall connectedness in the fourfold. Arguably, being is the unity in the fourfold without having a particular designated place within it. Being is not one of the entities, but rather the rhythm in which they communicate with each other. Unlike Adorno, Heidegger at least attempts a philosophical articulation and clarification of what being at homeness means for grown-ups. Moreover, Heidegger connects his idea of being to Parmenides and Heraclitus, arguing sometimes that his concept of being is meant to capture the Heraclitean hen panta, one is all. For as Heidegger explains, united are all things in being. In fact, Heidegger reaffirms and restates this when he states that being is what gathers together and unites all things. Being at home is being at home with being. It is the practical realization of the hen kai panta. So in this sense, Heidegger's mature philosophy is in communication with the oldest metaphysics. Never mind his critique of the metaphysics that he wants to reject. His critique of metaphysics as a rationalism and subjectivism and objectivism is not a rejection of all metaphysical impulses coming from the first beginning, and potentially indicating here for us how the second beginning may unfold. However, I'm coming to the close. However, for all the metaphysical sentiments, if I can call them that, both Adorno and Heidegger balk at one idea, the idea of the permanent and indestructible. For even Heidegger holds that being is not some eternal or everlasting container for everything. Being is finite in its essence. The master chronicler of the state of not being at home in the world, Franz Kafka, once wrote, quote, "The indestructible is one thing. It is in each individual person, and at the same time, it is something common to all. Hence, the supremely indivisible connection among people." In another aphorism, Kafka writes, "Theoretically, there's the possibility of attaining perfect happiness by believing in the indestructible element in oneself and not striving toward it." End of quote. What would Adorno say? What Heidegger? I don't know. Maybe you can tell me. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ingo. Okay, so let's proceed to questions, commentaries, remarks. Yeah, Jeff, please. Your microphone's out.
Sorry, I'm muted. I'll have to go probably in another 15 minutes or so, so I'm hoping to get my question in quickly. Really, thanks for the paper, Ingo. And I'm very interested in, I hadn't read that Adorno piece before, and it really is very interesting when you combine it with the Lukács and the and Bloch, of course, as well as Heidegger. And one of the reasons I think it's especially interesting is that if you go to the Dordrecht Man in Space seminar and Sternberger's comments on Heidegger's paper at that seminar, Sternberger's comments are focused on this idea that he says what we've got here, what Heidegger's doing is taking us back to, and he doesn't quite use it homeness, but to this idea of a home on earth, and his example back to Eden, he says. And this is a problem. This is the sort of thinking that is always going to end up in a bad place. And that critique which we find in Sternberger, has since been echoed again and again and again in critiques of Heidegger's use of the notion of home. It's occasionally echoed in writings against Bloch, but less so because Bloch is not seen as problematic in the same way Heidegger is. And I'm just wondering if you can
better
comment
being
on
a
that.
Stalinist than a Nazi.
Yeah. So, but you know, I mean, it also shows just how much this idea of at-homeness is deep within modernism, right?
Yes, Romanticism. And so it is interesting. You see, Lukács, Lukács, of course, Lukács would say, oh, the Greeks didn't write about being at home. They were at home.
Yeah.
So
well,
that's
Heidegger would say that as well.
Yes, of course. Oh, I think yes. And just to the point of the critique of Heidegger's concept of home, I've given you the quote here that it actually it is one of the means by which we allow the possible to be, you know, there. It is precisely not closing, you know, and circling the wagons around us and, you know, keeping out the foreign. It is an openness towards the other. Heidegger specifically says in 1946, of course he has to say it, but he does write about it, that it is not a nationalist concept. It is not, you know, and I don't think it is. And as I try to do with the I mean, Lukács he wrote that in 1917, and Bloch wrote his in 1950. Well, we don't know
59.
exactly.
Well, 56 to 59, somewhere around there.
Yeah, but I mean, but there are different versions. There are different versions.
Yeah. But I mean,
huge differences.
The Heidegger position you're talking about is, I mean, this is also true of Bloch's concept of homeland as well.
Yeah. But you see what, okay, thank you. I agree with you, I guess.
May I add also something, because you didn't talk about Hegel, who is using this Heimatlichkeit and being at home also. But the interesting point,
with the Greeks.
Yeah, but not only with the Greeks. And the interesting point seems to me that he thinks that now his concept of, call it metaphysics or philosophy, that his concept of philosophy, namely speculative articulation of the situation we are in, is necessary for gaining again this homeliness. And that seems to be a little bit different to the Heideggerian approach. And I would like to hear from you how you would compare these two approaches.
So on the Hegel Heidegger front, I think the most important difference is that Heidegger doesn't have the historical approach that Hegel has. Writes from a perspective of being at the can you still hear me?
We can still hear you.
Yes.
Can you still hear me?
More or less,
okay.
Yes.
Oh, I'm not. I think my. So I think there's a difference in.
Well, we can't see you, but we can hear you. So your video. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've given away.
Oh yeah, it's back.
I think you're breaking up occasionally. That's all. Just keep going.
Okay, I'm breaking up because of so I'll take out my video and I will not just use my hands because maybe I should talk with my mouth. I think one of the big differences is that in Hegel you have a much clearer sense of how that being at home emerges out of history, whereas in Heidegger it is against metaphysics, and that's a huge distinction. Hegel is much more a thinker of, you know, taking together history in a positive sense instead of saying, well, there has to be a total break and so on and so forth, which means that Heidegger has a hard time situating his own reference to the home He could have. I mean, Heidegger does quote Novalis. He does do that twice, but he doesn't actually engage that in a proper sense. I think in Heidegger, the fourfold is a little bit like, a shot. It's a brilliant shot, but it is, a piece by itself. So if you ask me, I'm actually much more on the Hegel side, in particular, because Hegel too has a concept of the home as being open to what is not at home. He's precisely
Absolutely.
having
Yeah.
that, the foreign is part of our home. And he develops that very nicely with regard to the Greeks, who understood that they were living from or combining different traditions. So I think that the Hegel account is very, very important. And I did bring in the Hegel. I think Heidegger does not, for various reasons, he thinks that Hegel is just the precursor to the communists or something like that. That's just that's just Heidegger's perspective. So he's against dialectics and so on and so forth. But I think that the crucial part in the early Hegel, in the theological writings, is, the need of philosophy, das Bedürfnis der Philosophie, is to overcome the divisions and dimensions. That is a metaphysical impulse, in my view, that we can take up. It has nothing to do with a formal conception of metaphysics as, being qua being thing. It is a metaphysical experience. That's why I liked something in Adorno, that he calls it at least a metaphysical experience. And that at homeness, I think, is a genuine human need. And I think it comes up and it bubbles up in different formations. It bubbles up in particular in modernity because of the dimensions and the fractures within modernity. And that's why Hegel is so good. He understands that it comes within modernity. He understands that concept. Whereas in Heidegger, I find him, I guess I'm the Heidegger apologist for other people, but I'm also quite critical. I find him, he's not developing his themes properly. Now you know.
Just one small point, because that point about the relevance of the foreign to the domestic, that is there in the Ista lectures.
Yes. Thank you so much.
It's not
he gets it from Hölderlin. Hölderlin is the
I know.
one. That's the letter
but
to.
It's not entirely absent. It's not entirely absent.
No, it is not. It is actually, and it is crucially within the Hölderlin stuff. So it is actually within the Nazi period that he actually says, wait a minute, what does Hölderlin tell us? And he says, you only come into your own when you understand the foreign. And then he's playing around, what is our own and what is the Greeks? And apparently the Greeks have fire and we have clearness of thought or something like that.
Only a short remark, Ingo. Even though I totally agree in your account, one has to be fair a little bit to Heidegger, because he gave 17 lectures and seminars on Hegel, and later his attitude to Hegel has changed at least a little bit. So he has at least seen that he has to cope with that different approach, and therefore, in order to be fair, he knew about the problem. Okay.
Thank you so much. And just also in fairness, from very early on, Heidegger, I've just recently read where he says, well, the only one who could write philosophical critiques was Hegel, or something like that. So he has, in between, he has also those kind of acknowledgement of Hegel. It is definitely there. I wish he had, I'm not so familiar with the later stuff, but yes, Hegel is an important reference point for him. Absolutely.
Yes, thank you.
Well, yeah, we have some more time. Yeah, and if there are no questions from other speakers or participants, yeah, I'd like to ask you this one small question. Yeah, I read that line in Heidegger's piece on das Wesen des Grundes or something like that. So the ground, no, or like the essence of ground. Well, where he cites that line from Novalis. Yeah, so basically philosophy is just an attempt to come home. And
Yes.
by the time it struck me, because like it pretty much aligned very well with like, you know, we say like what Robert Brandom says about explication and like this coming home, so that like we regain or re-achieve what we have already always had, right? And so like we're just kind of, well, bringing it home, like, you know, as the American expression goes, and we're just putting it in front of our like mental eyes and so on, right? So what do you think of that comparison? Because like, well, it seems to be similar, but still, like, you know, this Novalis and Heidegger's take, so they go way beyond this kind of like mere explicative reading. And also Socrates comes to mind, like, you know, this kind of examination, like, you know, the unexamined life isn't worth living and so on. So like how, what's your stance on that constellation?
Well, first of all, I think my reference to putting Adorno and Heidegger close to the Romantics wasn't meant to argue that therefore we should not take it seriously. It was actually the other way around, saying that the Romantics speak to us today if we are able to pick that up. And so there are obviously other references concerning, you know, coming back home. I think in Heidegger, it's I'm very happy to accommodate the Socratic notion of you know, accounting for your life. I think that is precisely what it is. And if you want, Socrates was very much the Athenian who thought it was his responsibility to say something about his home, and that was
So
part
he
of
never
it.
left Athens.
Yeah. So I'm totally so I can relate to that. I should say perhaps you have asked a question. So there is a burgeoning literature on Heimat, in particular in the German speaking world, and I from time to time I pick up a book about that, and I have the feeling that sometimes it is not as reflective as it should be. It's very often as if there is, you know, something to hold on to and something that we can, you know, find our refuge in our Heimat. And so I think we need to see it in a more in all its complexity. That's what I would be saying. So Harald, what is it? Schmidt has written just recently a book on Heimat, where I'm not so sure whether I agree with that. But that is a long topic. What interests me is, you know, how to make sense for metaphysics as that being at home in the world. As I said, I would like to understand it as a condition, as a human condition. And that certainly doesn't mean that we live in our own homes. In fact, Heidegger very nicely says homelessness is precisely also present in the places where people live in homes. So he's obviously talking about an ontological condition that he's trying to say. And again, if you think about Hölderlin, poetically, we live on earth. It is precisely we're living on earth poetically, and it is precisely in contrast to the rich businessman. If you read it up, it's actually fascinating. It's totally different than the critique of Heidegger usually insists that it is, you know, a very narrow-minded concept and so on and so forth. I don't think that. So I have a different reading. I'm not sure whether I answered your question.
Well, yes. You have, and this whole thing, like, you know, with striving towards home, it has got some like very heavily loaded religious undertone, like, you know, with this Garden of Eden and us, like humankind getting expelled for like sin, and ever since we are wandering on the earth, like, lost and, well, heimatlos, and so on and so on. Yeah.
Yeah.